The Nuclear Family Reader. The first book I ever loathed was given to me as assigned reading. I was 6 years old. It was first grade, and the book was Jimmy and Sue. You might think I hated Tip, the book I'd been given to use the previous summer. I learned to read while reading Tip. My brother Frank, 4 years older than I, decided he would teach me to read before the school did. St. Hilda's, the school he'd attended in the city before our move the year before to Long Island, had given Frank that book when he was learning to read. I disliked the book Tip, but I disliked it only because it was the means by which I was being coerced into the difficult task of deciphering the written word. There was a terrier on the cover. He was rendered in oil, I think. His fleece, or whatever it is, a terrier on the cover of a first-grade primer used in an Episcopal Institute of Learning with Sport, was as ruffled as the English language itself. Frank knew I dreaded the prospect of going to first grade, and he knew somehow that I had everything to dread. He dropped Tip on the back porch one afternoon as I sat staring at the maple tree I'd been stuck in a few weeks earlier after climbing too high. The neighbors had helped me down. "This is Tip, Fred," said Frank. I thought he was going to read it to me. I won't bore the reader with the tortuous path I traveled over the next 3 weeks in learning to read, but suffice it to say that, by the time first grade started, Frank had managed to get me to read Tip aloud from cover to cover. If everything else in first grade was unadulterated misery, reading was no task at all. I knew how to sound out words based on the relation of consonants to vowels. I do not believe half the readers of any age at this moment know how to sound out a word. Frank taught me to do this. He learned it in parochial school. Because he did not trust the public school to teach me to sound out words, he acted before the school could. This brings me to my contempt for Broadway School's text, Jimmy and Sue. The other kids hated Jimmy and Sue for the reason I'd hated Tip. But I, who had met the challenge Tip represented, could afford to hate Jimmy and Sue for what Jimmy and Sue, the characters, symbolized. While other kids were trying to memorize Little and Green, the last names of Mr. Little and Mr. Green, Jimmy and Sue's conformist neighbors, names I despised because they meant things, and therefore proved the writers were trying to condescend to us, I had leisure in our little semicircular huddles to imagine the lives of the clock punchers who put Jimmy and Sue together. Jimmy and Sue lived in a Levitt development, or something like a Levitt development, and were forever looking for their unambitious puppy, which was not named Spot, because the company that put out Fun with Dick and Jane would have sued the publishers of Jimmy and Sue to a fare-thee-well in some anonymous Levitt-designed courtroom, but which had some other bland name, Pepper, I think, and who had none of the majesty of Tip, who stood on hills of victory, Episcopalian hound that he was. The teacher could never stump me in English. With math she could and did, but she couldn't beat me over the head with the written word, as she did with plus signs, equal signs, and the little drawings of 6 logs added to drawings of 5 logs, which were equal to what, Fred? How I hated the logs. The premise of the log equations was that a hard worker wanted to buy 2 piles of logs, each with a different quantity of logs, and he had to know how many logs would be in the 2 piles. I hated the hard-working purchaser of logs. I always had to stay in the classroom during recess so as to be cajoled into getting the answer. I never could. But at least when Jimmy and Sue passed the house of Mr. Green and waved and peered under the hedge he was trimming, because they were looking for Pepper, at least when they passed the property of Mr. Little, who was raking a pile of autumn leaves which didn't yield Pepper, for whom they still searched, I didn't have to worry about how to pronounce anything. That my teacher couldn't make me panic as we read of the doings of these perfectly bland characters who were drawn in such predictable proportion, strolling their evenly trimmed, cleanly raked post-World War II hellscape, was my one consolation in that year of seat work. Children, we're going to do seat work. This was her word for being seated while writing. I could write letters properly, and if I did not always spell correctly, I knew the meanings of the words. I believe that irritated her. Numbers I had trouble with, and it was her glory. In any case, Frank taught me to read. He taught me one other thing 2 years later. I had to learn the times table. One night after school, he had me up to about 1 in the morning until I could do the multiplication tables up to 12 times 12. It didn't help me in any other kind of math, but it saved me in that instance. I had a test the next day. I am convinced that had my brother not taught me to read, or, more to the point, if he had not taught me how to sound out words, and that if he hadn't done this when he did, I'd have fallen victim to the belief, which most public schools drive into the souls of their convicts, that my difficulty with the curriculum was an indication of bad character. If Frank hadn't taught me how to navigate the written word, my lifelong failure in math would have been a part with what, no doubt, would have been a lifelong fear of written language. I don't think I'd have ever had trouble with the spoken language. I came from generations of people who spoke with proper grammar. When I was read to before bed, I was read fairy tales rendered in ornate language. Jimmy and Sue were cookie-cutter emblems of a society desperate to fit in. They were as frozen in place as everything Midas touched. Jimmy and Sue had never heard of Midas, of course. Their parents never read to them, and they didn't have a brother who taught them to read.